Chapter 7 Pregnancy. Every day Napoleon questioned Corvisart, his physician, and the famous midwifery surgeon Antoine Dubois, Baudelot's rival. He plied them with interrogations. He tried to extract a statement from them. Well, is she pregnant? Do you really think she's pregnant? Tell me the truth. I'm quite capable of standing it. Prudently, the doctors confined themselves to hypothesis. We think so, sire, but we must wait before we can be sure. Waiting. Still more waiting. 2 weeks passed. Finally, the event was confirmed for the imperial couple's private ears. The Empress was pregnant. Napoleon was so delighted that he could not keep the news to himself. On July 16th, he announced it to the Austrian Emperor, "My brother and very dear father-in-law." Soon it was everybody's secret. Marie-Louise began to feel unwell. Napoleon wept with emotion. He had always had a horror of pregnant women, but this time the case was different. He was eager to show off his capabilities to his good people. He paraded his wife all over Paris. The Empress was to be seen at the opera, at the Salon, at the National Library, where she insisted on trying on Francis I's helmet and nearly put her eye out. Napoleon scarcely left her side. The eagle watched over her as though she were a hen with a chick. She mustn't be tired. She mustn't be annoyed. She must have everything she wanted. Napoleon laughed heartily when she told him that she had given a musical watch to her brother-in-law, Borges, and a more subtle joke, that she had cut a brush up fine and put it into the bed of Pauline's unhappy husband. Time went on, and her pregnancy ran its normal course. Seized with a strange scruple, Napoleon did not wish his repudiated wife to learn from anybody but himself about the impending birth of an heir. On September 14th, he wrote to Josephine, "My dear, I have received your letter of September 9th. I am glad to hear that you are well. The Empress is definitely 4 months pregnant. She is well, and is much attached to me." At the end of September, the court settled down at Fontainebleau. In the intervals between hawking and playing billiards, Napoleon thought about making arrangements for his future son's life. For a son it was going to be. He was certain of that. Fate, whose hand he had so often forced, could not refuse this last demand of his. Was he not lord of the world? When he frowned, kings jumped to attention like simple soldiers, and Pope Pius VII himself came to heel as fast as a whistled spaniel. Napoleon was happy, and he wanted everybody around him to be happy too. His joy must receive solemn sanction. Quite naturally, his thoughts turned to pregnant women and newborn children. Should he give away alms as the kings of France used to do when a dauphin was born? He owed it to his fame to go one better. He proceeded to turn the Society for Maternal Charity, hitherto a private affair, into a state institution, he endowed it handsomely in order to provide poor mothers with funds for taking care of their children and feeding them. Napoleon also concerned himself with abandoned children and orphans. He instituted inspection of all orphanages and issued decrees providing for everything: baby clothes, nursing, boarding out, apprenticeship. Nothing escaped him. Finally, he founded 6 schools for the education of orphans of legionnaires who had died in the service of the state. This was not all. Napoleon made provision for the future. When his son became emperor in his turn, he would want generals, ministers, diplomats. He would choose them from among men who at present were still children. Would it not be politic to create an immediate link between the King of Rome and a certain number of children, a link strengthened by gratitude, which would be some guarantee of their fidelity and their devotion? Napoleon adopted a number of children, gave them his own name, and organized a great baptism for them. The ceremony took place on November 4th at Fontainebleau, amid pomp calculated to appeal to the people's imagination. Some days earlier, the Minister of the Interior had announced Marie Louise's pregnancy to the prefects. At the beginning of November, it was related to the President of the Senate and then officially to the Austrian Emperor. On November 11th, Napoleon requested the bishops to order prayers for the Empress's happy deliverance. Henceforth, all France could rejoice. Everybody was required to celebrate the great event: senators, prelates, parish priests, poets, songwriters. The official muse turned her lyre to suit the street corner. Thanks to Hymen, thanks to love, Louise shall have a son. So her bosom, so her shape, announced to everyone. Still the people remained cold. They had little liking for the Austrian Empress, and they looked back with regret to Josephine, who was at least a Frenchwoman. War taxes weighed heavily on their shoulders, and every day the burden became harder to bear. Glory could not be cut up for food. Bread was needed on which to spread it. Meanwhile, want was making its appearance. Besides, this business of kings and crowns and pomp disturbed the people, as they recalled the Revolution in their equalitarian hearts. Was not Napoleon, who owed them his throne, seeking to restore a court just like that of the fallen sovereigns, with favorites ready, like their predecessors, to batten on the people's toil and sweat? The people saw clearly, for that was just what Napoleon contemplated. At the birth of his son, he proposed to revive the glories of the old regime. Monsieur de Ségur, the Grand Master of Ceremonies, was requested to look up speedily everything that had to do with the pregnancy of a queen, baptism, and the appointment and functions of a governess. Losing no time, the Grand Master of Ceremonies delved into the archives, extracted an armful of them, and arrived at Fontainebleau with the dust of them thick upon him. The emperor had a very definite idea in mind. He proposed to reorganize the household of the Princess of France. He discussed everything, settled the smallest details in person, and turned trifles into affairs of state. But the most delicate matter was the choice of a governess. Formerly, this post had been solicited by members of the leading families of France. The Comtesse de Marsan, the Princess de Guameni, and the Duchess de Polignac had held it in turn. Whom should Napoleon select? At this point, a vivid recollection helped the emperor to make up his mind. During the previous month of August, one evening at the Trianon, he had invited Madame de Montesquieu, the wife of his Grand Chamberlain, to dine at his table. She was 45, and was an irreproachable wife, a perfect mother of 5 children, and a woman of the highest birth, on whom backbiters broke their teeth. There she sat at the emperor's table. On her host's right, it was a Friday. Strange to relate, she did not touch a single one of the meat courses, which followed one another. She ate nothing but bread and butter. What an insult to the emperor, people whispered. But Napoleon, though he noticed everything, said nothing. Finally, an attendant placed 2 fast-day dishes in front of Madame de Montesquieu. "Here are the dishes you ordered, Madame la Comtesse," he said. Madame de Montesquieu hesitated for a moment. How would the emperor take it? Nevertheless, she boldly attacked her fish, while the guests exchanged scandalized glances. Napoleon still did not open his mouth. Such independence of character, such strength of conviction, were indices which there was no mistaking. Napoleon hesitated no longer. On November 22nd, 1810, Madame de Montesquieu was appointed governess to the Prince of France. "Madame," Napoleon said to her, "I entrust you with the fate of France. Make my son a good Frenchman and a good Christian. The 2 things go together." It was in fact upon the governess that the heavy task of bringing up the imperial child would devolve entirely. His mother would have no authority over him. She was to bring him into the world. That was all. Once he left the womb that bore him, he would belong to the state. Next, Napoleon completed the King of Rome's household. He appointed 2 under-governesses, a squire, Monsieur de Cancy, a physician, Monsieur Bourdois, an old comrade of his in the army of Italy, and, as in the case of the Empress's households, red serving women clad in amaranthine merino, and white serving women, and 2 cradle rockers in all, together with valets, ushers, and kitchen staff, some 30 persons. And what about foster mothers? They must not be forgotten. The choice deserved attention. Madame Mallard, Louis the 16th foster mother who was still alive, and Madame Poitrine, foster mother to the last Dauphin, were consulted. They furnished all the requisite information. It was a question of finding a woman in the best of health, who would give the best milk. Napoleon had surmised as much. Meanwhile, applications flowed in. The police made inquiries about the applicants. A midwife examined them, and then the doctors made first a preliminary selection, and finally a definite one. 3 bold wenches named Auchard, Corville, and Mortier remained in the running. They were shut up in a house rented for the purpose in the Rue de Rivoli. They were forbidden to leave it before the birth. It was a draconian rule, but their food was of fine quality, and their wages were high. In short, they lived a life of imprisoned ease. Meanwhile, the court had returned to its winter quarters at the Tuileries. The New Year festivities of 1811 took their course amid a fine parade of etiquette, but Napoleon had by no means finished his preparations. Where should the King of Rome reside? Without question, during the summer he would live at Moudon. It was the healthiest place in the neighborhood. But what about the rest of the year? Napoleon made up his mind to build a palace for his son on the hill of Chaillot, a palace to match the measure of his fame, which would put Versailles, Schönbrunn, and Potsdam in the shade. Fontaine furnished plans. The palace would have a colonnade 400 yards long, facing the Seine and the military academy. The estimate amounted to a mere 60 millions. Pending the building of the palace, the boy would live at the Tuileries, in the ground floor apartments, in the center of the palace, at present occupied by Duroc, the Grand Marshal. Grand Marshal though he might be, Duroc must turn out bag and baggage. Under the direction of the architect, Fontaine, floors and ceilings were repaired, and the apartments were redecorated. Upholsterers hung the bedchamber in Florentine green grogram, whose color would spare the prince's eyesight. Then the cradles arrived. Jacob de Malter provided one made of an elm root, in the shape of a skiff. Théomire du Tremy delivered another in oak, decorated at the sides with bas-reliefs. But what were these compared with the cradle which on March 3rd, 1811, the city of Paris presented to the emperor? It was designed by Prudhomme and executed by Théomire and Audiot. It was in the form of mother-of-pearl balusters spangled with golden bees, and resting on 4 horns of abundance, beside which watched the geniuses of strength and justice. At the head of it, Fame, hovering over the world, held up a crown of immortality, in the middle of which shone Napoleon's star. At the foot, a young eaglet gazed at the star, and spread its wings as though to fly towards it. The cradle was all silk, Nacarat velvet, gold, mother of pearl, and silver gilt, and its artistry made it a joy forever. Next, the governess concerned herself with the baby clothes. Madame Manet, who kept shop in the Rue des Miromesnil, supplied the linen, and Lesueur the dresses. Everything was the most delicate in linen cloth, and cambric, the finest pieces of lace, and embroidered muslin were sent to the Tuileries. An outfit for the foster mother also had to be provided. It was Madame Auchard, a buxom, fresh, healthy gossip, who finally got the job. She was bursting with pride and robustness, and her broad face looked all the more round because, as a measure of hygiene and as preventative against fleas, her hair had been closely cropped. Napoleon insisted on settling all these details in person. Nothing could be done without his consent. He went so far as to summon Barbier, his librarian, and request him to appoint a committee and draw up a list of all the books which would be required for the King of Rome's proper education. Then, pencil in hand, and breaking the point of it every other minute, he regulated the ceremonial for the childbirth. While all these preparations were coming to a head, Marie-Louise kept on quietly rounding out. "I'm turning into a monstrosity," she said. Her health was, in fact, excellent, but the least little discomfort became unendurable to her. Sometimes it was her stomach, sometimes it was her back, sometimes it was her corns. She thought she was on the point of death, and summoned Corvisart. "Well, you old charlatan," cried Napoleon, at the sight of him, "have you killed many people today?" "Not many, sire," replied the doctor modestly. "I'm not so sure you haven't. If not, what are you looking so glum about? Are all your patients on their feet again?" Corvisart responded only with a smile. Then, with an air of great gravity, he examined his patient. He ordered for her pills of sugared breadcrumbs and drops of plain water. They worked wonders. Thus restored to health, the Empress resumed the normal course of her life. She got up at 10 o'clock, had breakfast, and then read or embroidered. In the afternoon, if the weather was fine, she followed coursing in a carriage. If it rained or snowed, she played billiards with Napoleon, or went to the Comédie Française, the opera, or the Opera Comique. In the evening, she entertained her friends, and attended court theatrical performances and balls. On March 4th, she drove to the Parc Monceau. This was her last outing in a carriage. After that, she went out only on foot to take the air on the terrace of the Tuileries, overlooking the Seine. But she had to make her way through the increasingly thick crowds which gathered to gape at her. A pregnant empress was a spectacle as rare as that presented by the comet which gleamed in the sky that year. So Napoleon ordered an underground passage to be constructed from the Tuileries to the terrace, and this enabled Marie-Louise to escape the curiosity of the populace. In her apartments, she interested herself in the outfit which was being prepared for her childbirth. It consisted of any number of night dresses, brassieres, sheets, night caps and bandages. Brussels and Valenciennes point lace figured largely in it. The bed, in which once it was all over, she was to look her best, was in itself a masterpiece. It was all French point lace, and it cost 120,000 francs. People were to talk about it with admiration for the next 50 years. But the most interesting item in her outfit was provided by the clergy. On March 14th, the parish priest and church wardens of Notre Dame at Chartres, presented to the Empress, as was the custom in the days of queens, a night-dress of embroidered satin cut from the model of the Virgin's blessed night-dress, which had been kept in the cathedral treasury for the past 800 years. This precious gift would spare her the pangs of childbirth. Marie Louise's time was soon at hand. Napoleon had lost something of his assurance. He felt that he was on the point of settling accounts with fate. It was a settlement on which his whole life, his whole future would depend. Would he come out on the credit or the debit side? In any case, he would have one consolation. He was going to have a child of his own, a legitimate child whom he would be free to parade in public, to caress in public. He had always been fond of children, but this time it was going to be his own, his very own. What would it be? Day and night, Napoleon brooded over the enigma which his wife carried within her, over the mystery which no science in the world could as yet clear up. Would it be a boy, or would it be a girl? God alone knew, and there was no altering his decree. But Napoleon's fighting soul rose up in rebellion against this inevitability. It humiliated him. He exerted all his willpower at full strength to impose it upon those forces that were maturing life in an unknown sphere, where human reason, human power had no place. Chapter 8. A Dramatic Childbirth. On March 19th, a theatrical performance was to be given at the Tuileries in honor of the Duke of Würzburg, Marie Louise's uncle. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and the guests were already arriving. But what was this? The Duchess de Montebello came out of the Empress's apartments, and she was still in day dress. In day dress after 7 o'clock in the evening. What could have happened to excuse such a breach of etiquette? Rumor ran rife. The lady of honor confirmed it. Her Majesty is beginning to feel her first pains. Promptly the gathering broke up. Everybody attached to the court went home, got into uniform, and returned to the Tuileries to take up the post assigned to him. There was no hesitation, no indecision. Napoleon had regulated the procedure of the childbirth just as he drew up a plan of battle. As soon as the Empress felt her first pains in her back, he sent for Dubois, the midwifery surgeon, who had been staying at the palace for several days past. Napoleon also dispatched pages to the princes and princesses, the president of the Senate, and the prefect of the Department of the Seine. Then he returned to his wife. In her bedchamber, Marie Louise groaned heartbreakingly. Dubois, who had hastened to the scene, her lady of honor, her lady of the bedchamber, Madame de Montesquieu, and her nurse busied themselves around her in vain. "Oh, it hurts," she wailed. "It hurts." A frightful pang stabbed her, as she could not remain lying down. Napoleon walked her up and down the room on his arm. He kissed her, caressed her, and lavished encouragements and endearments upon her. From time to time, when her suffering was less intense, he went out to the Hall of Graces, to keep his family informed. With her black eyes shining and her hands in her lap, Napoleon's mother, Madame Mère, waited silent and stiff. She had been the first arrival, and she was followed by Eugene and Hortense, Josephine's son and daughter, Prince Borges, and the Duke of Würzburg. Here, too, were the doctors, ready for emergencies, like the guard, 5 in all, with Corvisart at the head. Every member of the court was present, awaiting the arrival of the imperial child. The bells of Notre Dame rang out over Paris. Who could hope to sleep on such a night? Drawn from their beds, the people of Paris flocked, yawning, to the Tuileries Palace. With every window lit, up it stood out against the dark, chilly sky like a gigantic chandelier. Time went on, and the court, having nothing to do, began to feel that Marie-Louise's deliverance lagged. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Napoleon kept on the move between the Empress's bedchamber and the Hall of Graces. He questioned Corvisart eagerly, this time with no sarcasm. Do you think it would be possible by now to tell the child's sex? Couldn't you give me some idea? The doctor shook his head. We can only wait, sire. In the drawing rooms of the Tuileries, a solemn silence had at first prevailed, but dignity was soon dropped. People formed groups, chatted, and argued. Would it be a boy or a girl? This question gave spice to every conversation. To make it still more interesting, bets were laid. The betting on a boy was 10 to 1. Corvisart was of opinion that the birth would not take place until the next day. Everybody thought that the Empress was overdoing it. To keep all these people patient, Napoleon cast about for something to occupy them. Would not the best thing be to give them food and drink? So at midnight, by the Emperor's orders, footmen served supper in the drawing-room. Wine, punch, chocolate, cold meat. The company fell to, and things went better. So the night slowly passed. 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. People nearly yawned their heads off. Old chamberlains slept standing on one foot like herons. Fatigue drew dark rims around everybody's eyes. The ladies scarcely dared to look at themselves in the mirror. Their paint had long since melted, and their powder vanished. Their crumpled frocks might have come from the rag pickers. Lines of courtiers drowsed, leaning against the gilded walls. Fair heads sank to the shoulders of hussars and horse grenadiers. It was cold. The candles died one by one. The silence was broken only at intervals by the sound of a snore. All at once, as though at the touch of a magician's wand, a voice brought the sleepy company to life again. It was that of the Colonel General on duty. He was reading a bulletin drafted by Corvisart and Dubois. Her Majesty, the Empress, began to feel the pains of childbirth yesterday evening, about 8 o'clock. They lessened during the night, and almost ceased towards dawn. Her Majesty's condition is quite satisfactory. General consternation greeted this news. How much longer would they have to wait? But the Colonel General at once went on to say that the Emperor gave everybody permission to retire. At last, Nobody waited to be told twice. In a few moments the drawing-rooms were deserted. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. Napoleon went upstairs to his apartments. "Prepare me a very hot bath," he said to Constant, "and then you can get me breakfast." He undressed, wrapped himself in a white swanskin dressing gown, donned a nightcap, thrust his feet onto red slippers, and made his way to the bathroom. He got into the bath, lay down, and lolled back. Then he frowned. The bath was not hot enough. He turned on the faucet. Boiling water gushed out, and steam filled the room. It was through this vapor, as dense as mist, that the valet Constant suddenly made his appearance, pale and stammering. "Sire, sire!" "What's the matter?" cried Napoleon. "Speak, man!" "It's the doctor, Dr. Dubois. He's here. He wants to speak to you at once." "All right, send him in." The surgeon rushed distractedly towards the Emperor, with his face distorted, and the two tufts of frizzled hair on either side of his bald skull bristling with panic. "Oh, sire, sire!" Napoleon stared at him. Obviously the fellow brought bad news, but bad news had no effect on the Emperor at the time when he heard it. He did not react to it until an hour afterwards. He sat up in his bath and cried, "Well, is she dead? If she's dead, she'll have to be buried." Dubois jumped as though he had the hiccups. "Oh, sire, no, sire, but the water in the womb has dispersed. It doesn't happen in one case in 1,000, and it has to happen just here and now." Napoleon cut short the fellow's lamentations sharply. "Come, come, let's have the facts." "Sire, my position is a delicate one." Napoleon wriggled in his bath like a triton in a pond. "Keep your head, for God's sake. Forget she's the Empress. Treat her just as you would treat a shopkeeper's wife in the Rue Saint-Denis." "The fact is," stammered Dubois, "that the child is coming out awkwardly, feet first." "Well, what are you going to do?" The surgeon lowered his voice. "I shall have to use forceps." Napoleon shuddered at the word. "Will there be any danger?" "No, not exactly, but I may have to choose between the mother and the child." The Emperor reflected for a moment or two. Then, raising his head, he looked Dubois straight in the face. "Save the mother, it's her right." He stopped for a moment and went on. "If she lives, I can have another child. Now go back to the Empress. I'll follow you." Napoleon jumped out of the bath, and, dripping as he was, pulled on his clothes. A few moments later, he entered Marie-Louise's bedchamber, just as they were moving her from one bed to the other in order to make it easier to apply the forceps. She was struggling and sobbing. "No, no," she cried. "I won't have it. You're going to kill me. I don't want to die." She caught sight of Napoleon and held out her arms to him. "Am I to be sacrificed because I'm an empress?" Napoleon went over to her, took her in his arms, and tried in vain to reassure her. Then Madame de Montesquieu reasoned with her calmly. "But it isn't anything, madame. Look at me. I had to have the forceps twice. It didn't do me any harm." Standing motionless, Madame Mère stared at her daughter-in-law, tight-lipped. Good heavens, what a fuss! Just over a childbirth. When Marie-Louise had brought 8 children into the world like herself, she would have a right to talk. Then Napoleon spied Dubois standing at the foot of the bed, as though he were dreaming. "Well, what are you waiting for?" "For Corvassar, sire. His presence is essential." Napoleon suspected the cause of the surgeon's embarrassment. "If you mean you want a witness, what's wrong with me?" He gave Dubois a push. "Come on, can't you imagine you're bringing a cobbler's son into the world?" Just as Dubois was taking off his coat, Corvassar came in, followed by Yvon and Bourdois. The three of them held the Empress by her arms and legs, while Dubois made ready to operate. Marie-Louise started screaming, at first shrill and spaced. Her cries soon became hoarser and more frequent, until they merged into an endless, wild, inhuman clamor. Napoleon could not stand it. Stopping his ears with his hands, he fled and took refuge in a small room. Marie-Louise's cries, though deadened, still reached him through the walls. His temples were moist, and he felt faint. He put his forehead against the coolness of a window pane and waited. Minutes went by. They seemed centuries. Would this torture never end? It lasted 23 minutes. At last, here was Yvon, the surgeon. "It's over, sire. You may come." Napoleon hurried back into the bedchamber. A little heap of inert, reddish flesh lay on the floor. Napoleon stepped over it. He had eyes only for his wife. He covered her with kisses and caresses. "Louise, my dear Louise, it's all over now. You won't suffer any more." Inert, breathless, soaked with sweat, half unconscious, Marie-Louise could not speak, but she smiled faintly. Meanwhile, Corvassar and Madame de Montesquieu had picked up the child. They bathed him in warm water, massaged him, and inserted a few drops of brandy into his mouth. At the end of 7 minutes, the child uttered a cry. At the sound of it, the Emperor swung round. "My son, he's alive," said Corvassar. Madame de Montesquieu presented the newborn babe to Napoleon, wrapped in warm napkins. Napoleon hesitated to take him. His hands trembled. At length he clasped the child to his breast, but his legs gave way under him. He closed his eyes and clung to Madame Laetitia, who had hurried to his side. "Kiss him, mother," he said. Meanwhile, Corvassar supplied appropriate information. "It's a male child. He is well made, and weighs about 9 pounds. He measures 20 inches. In his turn, Napoleon kissed the child. Then he carried him to Marie-Louise. The Duchess de Montebello was bathing her face and arranging her hair. "Here's your son," he said. "Our son. Thank you, Louise." No sooner had the Empress given a kiss to the King of Rome than Napoleon took the child from her and made his way to the Hall of Graces. He stood in the doorway, and, holding the child in the air, showed him to his family. Then he gave the order which was to carry the news to the 4 corners of the world. My pages, and the 101 guns. Waving aside his family's congratulations, he went upstairs to his apartments to dress. It was nearly 9:30. "Well, Constant," he said to his valet, "we've got a fine son." But he wasn't in any hurry. "My poor wife had a bad time of it. At that price, I don't want any more children." He shook his head, and wound up. "I'd have been more at ease on a battlefield." While he donned his uniform, he listened. The batteries of the Imperial Guard started firing salvos, then relaying the bells of Notre Dame. Bells rang out from every church tower. The brazen voices of guns and bells merged together and broke upon the sky of Paris to announce the birth of the imperial child. Napoleon went to a window and looked out. The great city, suddenly aroused, buzzed like a hive. Napoleon could imagine what was happening. He could see housewives in their shawls coming out on their doorsteps, carpenters deserting their benches, shoemakers laying aside their lasts, girls sitting at their toilets, opened windows and listening. Old men sat in their chairs, with their eyes suddenly lighting up again. Everywhere people were hastily dressing, coming out into the streets, hastening towards the Tuileries. At every corner, in every square, people stood gazing up into the sky, as though to read the signs which fate was about to write there. The emperor studied the crowd massed before him in the Tuileries gardens. They were waiting, silent, still. They knew their sovereign's ardent desire, and they listened with a clutch at their hearts. The guns kept on thundering, 15, 18, 20 salvos. If they stopped at 21, it was a girl. The 22nd would signify that a male child had come into the world. There was a deep silence. Another salvo. A great sigh of relief went up from the crowd. Their restraint broke down. An immense shout arose. "Long live the Emperor! Long live the King of Rome!" People started dancing, clapping their hands, kissing one another, throwing their hats in the air. Their delight, like a gathering wave, spread to the furthest corners of the gardens, swept the neighboring streets, filled the squares, and rose to the heart of Paris like racing blood. Napoleon shared in this explosion of joy. It was an extension of his own. He, the people, his son, did they not make up an all-powerful trinity, eternal in form? He had nothing more to desire. He had everything. God, Providence, had refused him nothing. His emotion stripped him of his strength. He felt giddy, as though he were on the brink of a precipice. "The future is mine," he murmured. Napoleon held on to a curtain with one hand, laid his forehead against the coolness of a window pane, and let the tears stream down his cheeks. Chapter 9. Early Months. For a few days, Napoleon was no longer his own master. His newfound fatherhood imposed a certain official duties upon him, and these he had no mind to shirk. But as soon as he was at liberty, he hastened to his son's cradle. He stood there for minutes at a time in ecstasy. He never tired of gazing at his son's big head, his nose that turned up so comically at the tip, his high forehead, his fine golden hair just beginning to curl. The child's little hands, above all, delighted him. They went through the motions of clutching something. What? The world. The world was his son's. Those little rosy hands, with their spatulate fingers, had uprooted the race of the Bourbons from France forever like rank grass. But all the fuss about his birth did not prevent the King of Rome from sleeping and thriving. For the time being, his Majesty sucked with avidity, with his rosy mouth in the form of a circumflex accent, his two tiny palms quite flat, and his little fingers spread out on Madame Ouchard's broad breast. Napoleon, however, imagined him already at table with him, drinking soup and eating Marengo chicken. One evening, at the beginning of April, he gave the child a prune to suck, just to see. The child coughed and nearly choked. Madame de Montesquieu hurried up, saved her nursling from strangling, and gave the Emperor such a look that he blushed. "I didn't know," he stammered. "I shouldn't have done it, I swear to you, madame. It shall never happen again." Another time the Emperor questioned Madame de Montesquieu about his son's doings and sayings. "Sire," she told him, "people are already presenting petitions to his Majesty." "Oh, are they?" said the Emperor. "Clever people. And what does his Majesty say to them?" "Nothing, sire," replied the governess, keeping a straight face. "Well, silence gives consent." On April 19th, Marie-Louise's churching took place with little ceremony. As Napoleon had a horror of ecclesiastical pomp, and the next day the whole court set off for St. Cloud. The King of Rome accompanied his parents. With his household, he was lodged on the ground floor, to the left of the chateau, in apartments which opened into the gardens. There he would have good air and be quiet, away from the commotion which his father created around him. Nevertheless, at the end of April, there was a flurry. Cases of smallpox were reported in Paris. At once the doctors took alarm. The little king must be vaccinated. The operation was carried out on May 11th by Hassan, doctor at the Hôtel du Hospital. It was a complete success. On May 31st, the scabs fell off, and they were attached as exhibits to Hassan's report on the case. It specified, among other things, that His Majesty had been purged with syrup of peach blossom and syrup of chicory, and that the effect was copious. Hassan got 6,000 francs for 6 cuts with a scalpel, not to speak of the advantage to his reputation. But by now, Napoleon was getting restless. The fact that he had a son was no reason why he should remain tied to him like a dog to a stake. The King of Rome had his governess, who was responsible for him. He had his household and his doctors to look after him. He had no need of the continual presence of his parents beside him. The Emperor was ready to be separated from his son, but not from his wife. Marie-Louise must accompany him. On May 14th, the Emperor and the Empress took up their quarters at Rambouillet. Thence, a week later, they set off for Cherbourg with 50 carriages and a brilliant military escort. At every halt, the imperial couple scattered gold and presents. Poor Marie-Louise found her martyrdom renewed day by day. Fetes, banquets, audiences, galas, balls, little leisure and less sleep. At Dreux, at Laguel, at Valognes, everywhere she went, she presented a pout and an air of dejection to the crowds that gathered to welcome her. "A regular death's head at a feast," said the Normans, disgusted at their failure to win a smile from her frowning face. Napoleon was in a hurry to reach Cherbourg. It was thence that he would take off for England. He must see how the preparations were going, but his visits to arsenals and ships did not make him neglect his wife. He loved having a joke with her. One day he took her in his arms. "Shall I throw you into the sea?" he said. "If you like," replied Marie-Louise, like a good girl. Another day, when she was visiting a flagship, Napoleon decided to spring a surprise on her. He ordered all the batteries to be fired at once. 60 cannon thundered all together. Marie-Louise shrieked and nearly died of fright. The days passed by, and it was time to return to Paris for the King of Rome's baptism. Before his departure, Napoleon had settled every detail of it. He wanted to have a colorful ceremony which would reflect his own power, strike the popular imagination, and give the Bourbons' remaining partisans something to think about. Off again, Napoleon returned at full speed, dragging his poor wife through a whirlwind of festivities, scarcely over her childbirth, pale and thin. She was exhausted in her efforts to keep up with him. On June 8th, the King of Rome was brought back from St. Cloud to the Tuileries. The next day, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the sound of guns, always guns, gave the signal for the festivities, and the cathedral bells echoed it. At the imperial palace, solemn audiences succeeded one another. At noon, the troops on duty set off for their post, from the Tuileries to Notre Dame, by way of the boulevards and the Place du Châtelet. Grenadiers, fusiliers, and light infantry lined the route. They waited more than 5 hours for the passing of the procession. At length it appeared. At its head came light cavalry, gendarmes, light infantry, and Mamluks. Then followed 24 carriages containing prefects of the palace, chamberlains, ladies of the palace, and great officers of state. These preceded the 4 carriages containing the princes and princesses. Next, flanked by a guard of honor, came the Empress's carriage, drawn by its 8 horses. In it, seated at the back, was Madame de Montesquieu, holding the little king on her lap. Opposite her sat the 2 under-governesses and Madame Auchard, the king's foster mother. Then it was the turn of the coronation coach. In it sat the emperor, wearing a plumed hat and a suit and cloak of crimson velvet, spangled with diamonds. Beside him sat the empress, wearing a dress of white satin, adorned with a sheath of silver gauze, with a diadem on her brow, a necklace round her neck, and bracelets at her wrist. She sparkled like her husband. Slowly the procession made its way through the crowds, which were enormous, but strangely silent. The curiosity which had drawn them there seemed hostile. This display of pomp, which recalled only too much the ostentation of the old regime. Was it not a challenge thrown down to the people, who still remembered that they had made the revolution? Their master owed them everything. With bitterness in their hearts, they saw thronging around him once more aristocrats of the former court, exiles restored to favor, a swarm of nobles again, as insolent as in the old days, thrusting workmen out of their way, and lashing out with their whips at pedestrians who did not stand aside quickly enough for them. This parade of luxury, too, taunted them with their own property. It made them anxious about their future, in which they could see nothing but want, taxes, and battlefields on which they would leave their bones. It was 7 o'clock when the King of Rome entered Notre Dame in his governess's arms. She carried him a mantle of silver brocade, over 7 ells long, trimmed with ermine. He wore his finest dress of Brussels point lace, and a bonnet which was a masterpiece. The broad ribbon of the Legion of Honor crossed his chest, and his Majesty made a great meal of it, slobbering on it copiously. Immediately behind him came his foster mother, parading herself in all the glory of a white silk dress. Hippolyte, the famous barber, had done her hair for the occasion, providing her with hundreds of little curls which strayed out of her fine cap of needlepoint lace and clung funnily around her broad face. Then the imperial family entered the cathedral. The 2 godfathers, the 2 godmothers, the emperor and the empress, each with a canopy held over them, and behind them the whole court. Once the sacrament was administered, Napoleon took his son in his arms, kissed him, and held him up in the air to show him to the congregation. A great shout filled the vast cathedral. Long live the King of Rome! After the Vivat, the grand chaplain intoned the Te Deum, and the ceremony was over. The little king at once returned to St. Cloud with his governess, but for the emperor and the empress the day was not yet ended. There was a banquet at the city hall, followed by a concert and a reception. Meanwhile the populace, excluded from these festivities, danced, sang, and feasted on their own account. On June 16th, Napoleon returned to compliment of the city of Paris, and gave a banquet at the Tuileries. In all, 9 covers for the emperor and his family. It was a grand cover, the same as in the time of the kings. The guests watched their sovereigns eating, and felt very much honored. On that day, again, there was nothing for the populace, but they were compensated on June 23rd at St. Cloud, where festivities were organized for them on a scale unknown in the memory of man. 300,000 Parisians flocked to these festivities. The whole day was spent in feasting and entertainments. But the company had to wait till nightfall for the finest thing of all. The park and the waterfalls were illuminated, and a fireworks display was given by the guards, who embarked in boats and fought a mock naval battle on the Seine, while overhead Madame Blanchard, in a balloon, set aerial fireworks crackling across the sky. When these festivities were over, Marie-Louise felt that she might at last lead the quiet, regular life which suited her. She indulged herself. She petted herself. She devoted plenty of time to her person. She took lessons in pastel from Prudhomme and in watercolor from Isabey. She played slow waltzes with Pierre, her music master, embroidered with Madame Rousseau, posed for Gerard, who was painting her portrait. She took tea at a fixed time, drank Venice chocolate, stuffed herself with candies. In fact, Napoleon now allowed her some respite. He had resumed something of his independence. He gave up sleeping with Marie-Louise on the pretext of avoiding risks to her health. Dubois, the surgeon, had told him that it would be dangerous for her to have another child. The truth was that Napoleon was beginning to find himself bored in Marie-Louise's company. What could they talk about for any length of time? They had no memories in common. Was Marie-Louise to recall her childhood, lived under the threat of the Corsican ogre? Or was Napoleon to talk about his poverty-stricken youth, his life as a Jacobin officer, his acceptance of the material to make his general's uniform from Madame Taline, a lady of easy virtue? On the other hand, the affairs of the empire caused him much anxiety. He was in open conflict with his brothers, who traduced him and betrayed him. The war in Spain was exhausting the treasury and decimating his armies. Russia was becoming threatening, and Prussia was raising her head once more. England's money was arming Europe against him. War was close at hand, again. Napoleon's thoughts were with the hundreds of thousands of men who, from the four corners of his empire, were on their way to the eastern frontier. His sole moments of relaxation were those when his son was brought to him. At St. Cloud, he had reverted to his old habit of eating by himself. One day his table was set under the chestnut trees in front of the orangery. He ate in 10 minutes, just as he used to, throwing around him bones and orders which Duroc, Moret, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and Barbier, the librarian, caught as they flew. Napoleon frowned. Russia would take a lot of beating. She was a vast country, but he would strike at her heart, and make the Muscovite bear-skin his carpet. All at once his face lit up. In the distance, at the other end of a path, he could see Madame de Montesquieu coming towards him, carrying the little king. Behind her waddled the foster mother, clad in a dress and cloak of water-green levantine, and looking like a well-fed duck. The emperor stood up and went forward with outstretched arms. "Come to me, my little pup." He took his son skillfully from his governess's arms, kissed him, and raised him in the air. Amid a flutter of lace, he gloated over him. What a fine little fellow he was, with his shapely mouth, his curly golden hair, his bright blue eyes, that seemed to give back more light than they received from the summer sky. Napoleon probed into him, seeking himself within him. He gazed into the boy's enigmatic eyes, as though to catch a reflection of his own life. He listened with intoxication to the little heart beating against his breast, a faint echo of his own heart. Then he made a discovery which delighted him. "Look," he said to the governess, "he's got my chest, the deep chest of the Bonapartes." The child wriggled in his arms and whimpered angrily. "He's like me all over," Napoleon went on. "He's no patience." He sat down, put the child on his knee, and stared at him thoughtfully. So small, so weak, and already destined to rule the world. Instead of a toy, his father had thrust an empire into his dimpled arms. Napoleon longed to see him grown up, strong, fit to help him, and take his place in case of need. Life's slowness served only to quicken his imagination, but until then it was playtime. Napoleon had invented some games which scarcely anyone but himself found funny. He dipped his finger in the sauce on his plate and daubed it on the King of Rome's face. His Majesty licked it cautiously. Then Napoleon gave him a few drops of his Chambertin to drink. The child did not make a sound, but tears came to his eyes. "Sire," the governess intervened, in a reproachful tone, "you'll upset him." "You're quite right," agreed Napoleon, as he passed on to another amusement. He pulled the child's ears, rubbed his head with his palm, gave him a shake, and called him sir. The child pouted, and waved his little rose satin-shod feet angrily in the air. "Sire," Madame de Montesquieu intervened again, "you're hurting him." "So I am," assented Napoleon, but that did not stop him from carrying on a long conversation with his son. "We'll soon have fine Sèvres porcelain plates to teach you to read, and some still finer to teach you history. Papa's history to begin with. They're all ordered already." The little king, with his tip-tilted nose pointing to the sky, never took his eyes from his father, and followed every motion he made. "He can observe movements already," remarked Napoleon. "We'll make a great general out of him." On another occasion, the Empress joined the Emperor when he was with his son in the gardens. Napoleon held the child out to her. "Come, Louise, take your son." The Empress took the child, but she did not know how to hold him. "How awkward you are!" cried Napoleon. "I'm afraid of suffocating him if I hold him too tight," Marie-Louise confessed. "Then give him back to me." Napoleon took the child back. He really had the arms of a foster mother, this emperor, arms that were both sure and gentle. The little king found himself tossed up first to the right, and then to the left, and smiled his wonderment. Marie-Louise gazed at him rather shyly. This child was flesh of her flesh, but the links that bound her to him were growing weaker day by day. Could any woman really be a mother who had not herself cared for her child, watched over him, petted him, trembled at his smallest sign of fever, given him all the time her own patience, her own strength, her own ideas, the best of her life. Even if the Empress wanted to do all this, she could not do it. Court etiquette forbade her all those actions by which a mother proclaims her watchful love for her son. The little king now belonged to the state. Between him and Marie-Louise stood Madame de Montesquieu. It was she who took all decisions, gave all orders. Napoleon's will had transferred to her all the rights of the real mother. The governess bristled at the smallest infringement of etiquette, and the Empress had to beat a retreat. How could Marie-Louise help being jealous? Her lady of honor, Madame de Montebello, who had a great influence over her, did her best to set her against the governess. It was part of the clash between the brand new nobility, born on the battlefields, and the old aristocracy whose roots plunged deep into the history of France. For that matter, Napoleon had organized the King of Rome's household in such a way that the child had no need of his mother. Marie-Louise must always be in a position to accompany her husband anywhere at any time. Napoleon reminded her of the fact. Once more, the Emperor carried the Empress away with him in a whirlwind of traveling. This time it was a round of the chateau in the neighborhood of Paris. In the month of July, the court was at Trianon. At the beginning of August, it was at Rambouillet. On August 15th, it was back in Paris for Napoleon's birthday. In the evening, arm in arm, like lower-class lovers, the Emperor and the Empress went for a stroll through the fair on the boulevards. On August 24th, they returned to Trianon. 6 days later, this time accompanied by the little king, they settled down at Compiègne for 3 weeks. On September 22nd, the child went back to St. Cloud. Meanwhile, on the 19th, his parents had set off for Holland. Their journey lasted nearly 2 months. During all this time, the Emperor and the Empress were always on the road, sometimes passing through cities without stopping. They visited Antwerp, Amsterdam, Leiden, The Hague, Rotterdam. On October 30th, they were at Nijmegen. From there they reached Dusseldorf in 3 days. On November 11th, they arrived at St. Cloud. Marie-Louise was at the end of her tether. She had grown then, and her hair was falling out. "Good heavens," she cried, as she kissed her son. "He doesn't recognize me." "Sire," said Madame de Montesquieu, handing the child to his father, "His Majesty can say Papa, and he has cut 4 teeth. 4 teeth. He had cut the first on October 26th. The event was followed by the doctors and commented upon in the newspapers. The Emperor kissed his son. He knew what he must do next. The first tooth of a king was worth 1,000 times its weight in diamonds. Manna, in the shape of costly presents, rained down again upon every member of the household. In honor of that first tooth, Napoleon granted everything anybody requested: pensions, pardons, recall of exiles. the family spent the rest of November at St. Cloud. On December 1st, the King of Rome returned to Paris to take up his winter quarters in the Tuileries. There he stayed, for, on account of the hard winter, Napoleon decided that there should be no move to Fontainebleau this year. By now the boy was 8 months old. He was starting to toddle. His governess exerted herself to get him to say Papa and Mama properly by the new year. Meanwhile he played. He had no lack of toys. He had 9 pens, a boxwood doll's house, a miniature piano, and a sheep on wheels, which with all its bells made a noise like a stage-coach. But his finest toy was a present from his aunt, the Queen of Naples, who gave it to him for Christmas. It was an open carriage complete with carvings and engravings, a real carriage, as the people of Paris soon had a chance to see. Thanks to it, by the beginning of January, sightseers were flocking to the river terrace at the Tuileries. When the sun shone, they were presented with a free show, and a touching one. Here was to be seen a very unusual equipage, a little open carriage drawn by 2 sheep, led by a page. The sheep were 2 merino sheep, trained by Franconi, the circus manager. They were as white as Bashaw lambs, and their horns were gilded. In the carriage sat a pretty pink and white child, with golden hair that looked as though it were painted. He was clad in a dress of embroidered muslin, and a coat of blue levantine trimmed with swan's down. He held the reins in his little mittened hands, and his little feet, shod in blue morocco, kicked about gleefully. "What a heavenly child! Isn't he darling?" exclaimed mothers, with tears in their eyes. "Long live the King of Rome!" cried their husbands, throwing their caps up in the air. Attracted by the noise, Napoleon stood at the window of his study, summing up the significance of the scene. "Dear little fellow," he said to himself, "he does more than Wagram or Austerlitz to make me popular."